called M-E-T-I-S, Metis, who in real life is one of Zeus's daughters, but it meant street smart, cunning and savvy. Savvy comes from the Latin, you know, savoir in French, or savoir in French, savoir in Spanish. Cunning comes from Gaelic, I think it's Scottish, to ken. There used to be a word ken. You ken John Peel, but it's because you know. It's an old Scottish word for knowledge. That word, metis, meant it's what a great politician knows. What a great politician, street smart. In fact, a very famous philosopher who I once took a class by, Isaiah Berlin, talked about what do great politicians know. And he knew, he actually worked with Churchill and Roosevelt. And he said, Roosevelt was not that smart, Franklin Roosevelt, in a traditional way. He got all C's at Harvard, he didn't read that much, but he had terrific cunning, he had terrific metis. He could summarize a situation quickly and act on it. Churchill, who was very smart, could do the same thing. Cunning and the metis, another word. We would say street smart, people would dismiss that as sort of a silly word. It's enormously important. It's what generals had, great generals had that. Eisenhower had that as a general. He wasn't that smart probably in terms of books he's read, but in other ways. They had a lot of other words. I could keep going like this, but the one we're going to talk about, that's most, they had, let me tell you two others. One is gnosis, spelled with a G, G-N-O-S-I-S. You know the word Gnostic? That's where it comes from. This is a person who has type of secret knowledge, secret wisdom. They're very wise, but they sort of, in a spiritual way, they keep it to themselves. Sophia, the word philosophy means the love of knowledge and wisdom. Sophia is a catch-all word for knowledge and wisdom. Sophos, you have that word. Philos is love. Sophos is They have all these words. I don't want to get into Greek etymology here because I can keep it. But there's one word we're going to be talking about a lot. And this word, again, has no translation in English. It's phronesis. P-H-R-O-N-E-S-I-S. Not a word you hear much, but it's been written about a lot. This means practical wisdom. Wisdom in the world. That's what I'm going to be talking about. I have no qualifications to talk about spiritual wisdom. My wife can well tell you this. But I can talk a little about being wise in the world. That is the word they use from Nietzsche. It's translated as practical wisdom or practical reasoning. A lot of writing about this recently. So, let's be grounded. What people can we think of who had practical wisdom? Wisdom in the world. They acted with wisdom, but they were in the world.
Einstein.
Pardon?
Einstein.
Well, he did actually. It's a good example. He also had great other attributes, but he did. Gandhi, perfect example, exactly. Nelson Mandela, Abraham Lincoln. You can think of plenty of others. People like that. The word can also be applied to wise acts. Sometimes you have unwise people who do wise things. Let me give you a great example. I'll say, right, here's a great example. Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, I don't think anyone was necessarily a wise man. He was crooked as a snake. He was a bull. He did all sorts of things. However, he did some really wise acts. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act. He really gave a damn about black people and tried to help them. So you can have wise acts of a person who wouldn't be no Gandhi or Mandela.
I have a problem in accepting, you're mentioning people that we don't know about, but we really don't know at all. And I have a problem of sort of what everybody says, it's the public opinion defines it, and I don't even know these people.
Well,
I don't really know. I can't discern if it's wise because it's all hyped up.
Well, I wouldn't say that Mandela or Gandhi were hyped up. I mean, we do know a lot about them. I mean, one can really read. I use those examples because it's something everyone knows. I could talk about my Uncle Moish, but it's not it wouldn't necessarily help you that much. You know what I mean? We have to find common examples to talk about, Einstein or Gandhi or people like that. There's no other way to talk about it. I like to ground it in real people rather than just speaking out of the blue. So if we had to try to ask ourselves, what are some of the attributes of practical wisdom? And again, people have been writing about, but what are the attributes? If you had to break it down, a little bit what the leaf was doing with pedantic wisdom. And there's a sort of a consensus of scholars. Now this is just true for today. Who knows what will happen 20 years from now. One would be epistemic humility, which is not too far what the leaf was talking about. Epistemic, in other words, have some humility in what you think you know, what you're so sure about. I went to a big meeting at Harvard once, and that just drove me crazy. There's some very famous people there, so I was just, believe me, at the bottom of the totem pole there. But they were talking about, the conversation began to turn on science. These people thought science was the only way to know something. And although I certainly believe in science, great lover, but I very calmly said, you know, there are other ways of knowing things besides science. Well, I could have said that my hero was Martin Bormann or something like that. They really looked at me as if I was a Luddite or denouncing science. I have a quick temper. I got really angry. There's been 100 billion people who've lived on this planet since it started. You think all of them were wrong? Or probably 80 billion of them thought there were other ways of knowing things besides science. And they said, well, they were all wrong. I mean, it was such hubris, such incredible hostility with wisdom, epistemic humility. Even, I mean, I'm not, I love science. Obviously, I'm not going to say, well, there's an alternative to thinking. On the other hand, I sometimes read in the paper, I don't follow science that closely, but I read the papers, about entanglement and odd sort of things that are going on in physics that really make you wonder, do we really know anything? Everyone thought Newton was exactly right. Will never be challenged. And Einstein came and said, no, it's not exactly right. So even great scientists have epistemic humility. Einstein certainly did. Empathy. Another part of practical. There is no wisdom without empathy. Flat statement. The word wouldn't mean what it meant without empathy. Living in the shadow of the future, acting as if the future mattered, is a great element of practical wisdom. Acting as if the future mattered. I would say, again, the prime of these, and again, this is all debate, is bringing ethics into your life and into your arguments. Acting ethically. That's just what we don't do. I don't mean even all of us don't. It's a different thing. Those would be, I think, and we can talk about.
Could you say that wisdom has to be anything for a person that helps all of life to flourish?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, this isn't the Pythagorean theorem. We all have our own ways of talking about. Of course, I would say. I mean, it's not so different than what the Leaf was saying. As we talk, I've known the Leaf for quite a while, but as we talk in this formal way, you'll see a lot of commonalities. I mean, some people say that all of wisdom is one. I've read people saying that Chinese, Japanese, that there's just one type of wisdom, which probably would be to help life flourish. I mean, if I had to pick, it probably is that. Others would say no, they're really different. You can decide for yourselves. Those are tricky questions. So, why are we so interested in wisdom? That's a definite. Well, why did I get so interested in this? Why are you here? Why did this become so interesting? I'll tell you what really got to me in terms of my own interest in this, and you can all come across, you can all think about your own situations. Do you remember Robert McNamara? Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, right? Well, nice to talk to people your own age. Let me assure you, I teach a little bit at Columbia. Students, of course, are a hell of a lot younger than I am. And now and then, because I don't use notes that often, I speak off the top of my head. I once said Abbott and Costello. Who were they? I didn't need to be reminded how old I was. It happened nonetheless. So Robert McNamara, when he died, there's a large obituary about him in the New York Times. Of course, he's an important guy. And I began thinking, at the time I said, you know, and I sort of knew that, he was the youngest tenured professor at the Harvard Business School ever. A tenure as a professor at the Harvard when he was very young. He was the CEO of the Ford Motor Company at a very young age, and he was very good at it. He was really smart, very high IQ and all this. But he had no wisdom at all, zero. I mean, really didn't. I'm not condemning the guy, well, I would. He had no wisdom, he just had none. And he died a deeply unhappy man. He had one child, a son, who didn't speak to him for over 50 years. Maybe 4 or 5 million people died unnecessarily, which he contributed to their death. I mean, he wasn't an evil man, the way you say, but he was really, he never questioned what he was doing, and he believed totally in a form of logic that just made no sense. He never looked at what he was doing. He didn't act with any empathy. And yet he gets these big obituaries, and everyone said, oh yeah, well, he made some mistakes, but basically he was a good man. And I began thinking, wow, whatever happened to wisdom? Whatever happened to empathy? And he, you know, whatever happened to Christianity? I would throw that in too. Whatever happened to, you know, loving thy neighbor? And I began to question this, and then I began to look, whenever again, I read the New York Times and others, and to realize how people are evaluated. Not long ago, Trump appointed some clown to some sort of voting, what's the right word, some commission to look at how people are allowed to vote. And this was a guy from Kansas, and they said he was a Rhodes Scholar, went to Harvard, went to Stanford, went to Oxford, but this guy's job was to stop blacks from voting. But they never said he had no wisdom. They just used these qualifications, which happens all the time. Even as a boy, this happened. I mean, we elevate a type of knowledge in our society, and I don't mean just the U.S., believe me, I mean the Western world, and this is part of India too. I mean, this stuff has gone around the world. We elevate a way of knowing that elevates mathematical reasoning, logic, and a form of action that does not encompass virtue, does not encompass compassion, but it's just instrumental. It means it works, you know. Instrumental rationality. We completely abandon, for reasons that are too complex to go into here, and I'm not sure I know them myself. We abandon how people would have talked about this in the 17th century, or the 13th century, or the Greeks, going back 400 years. We just stopped it. I think the Enlightenment, I mean, the general consensus that it got stopped in the French Enlightenment in the 18th century. But we just talk about something, well, I mean, it happens over and over again. The Supreme Court, they appoint people because they went to Stanford Law School or Harvard Law School. I remember Obama, who had a little wisdom as a person, I think had some wisdom, said he wanted to appoint someone to the court who had empathy. And this is Sonia Sotomayor. And he got attacked for saying that. Really, now I think people liked attacking him anyway, he just was a target for a lot of people. But I think they really meant it. I think if you interviewed them, they really meant there's something wrong with a judge having empathy, which struck me as the single worst thing I can imagine saying. And yet it happened even now. People, so they appoint people who have no empathy, no wisdom. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. So what do we live by? If we don't live by wisdom, what do we live by? What do we live by? I mean, secular virtues. I'm not talking about religion. The whole other, although the two, certainly wisdom is certainly integrated with religion for many, many people.
So maybe we live by measures or metrics
Yeah.
or things that are easy to count.
Things that are easy to count. It's a good way to say that. We do live by things that are easy to count because it's easier than trying to think through difficult judgments. Intuition, well, that's good. No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, narcissism.
Right, that's a big one. I think we live through, a sort of a self-reflective type of self-absorption, which is it's an awful way to have a society that way.
I just want to mention, when you're talking about Sandra Sotomayor and her empathy, and that was a question, I think it's more important, this is what I believe, that to have the discernment
Yes, yeah. Well, that's, I'd say
Rather than
this,
empathy, it's.
I'd say discernment is a cousin of empathy, wouldn't you think?
I don't know, but when you said empathy, I thought, well, gee, discernment is what's more important, for a judge, to me.
Yeah. Well, I think the two are pretty closely related, though it's, again, these are all, well, so we live with, what, do we have an overall, what's the overriding narrative? You know, societies, all societies, have what we call a meta-narrative. I'm a great believer in stories. So we have a meta-narrative, not just little stories about our lives, but a general story. And all societies have these, they call meta. Ours has become a type of rational science and rationality, I would say, are the two, which have not always been the case, of course. But they don't tell you how to live. They're useful, very useful. I mean, clearly, I go to the doctor, I'd like him to help me, he uses science to help me.
I think we're absorbed, the broader we, in immediate gratification.
Yeah.
There is no broad look.
Right.
There is absolutely no broad look, and it's frightening to somebody like me.
Well, it's frightening to me too. I think it's frightening to a lot of us.
That's why we're all here. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, who gets rewarded in our society? Think about this. Who
Power
gets
and money.
rewarded?
The loudest.
Power and money.
Yeah, by a large percentage. It's really, although, it's astounding to me just how that happens. And yet no one, if I could get the word wisdom even mentioned, I said, in popular discourse, I would be very, very pleased. But I don't think it's going to happen. I don't know, because it's not valued. It's just not valued. That story, Brenda and I heard this great story. Remember Steve Schlein, who lives in our town? This guy, a friend of mine, had his 70th birthday party. His brother was there. His brother works for the New York Times, so I knew a guy who worked for the Times, and was sitting there chatting. He said to me that the editorial office, at that time, I think they moved, was on the 17th floor, and that's where all the poobahs are, the editor-in-chief and the senior guy. And so he was up there one time, and lo and behold, a big argument was occurring in their boardroom. He said, this never happened. The room was sort of very genteel and all, and everyone was, what are they talking about? Are they selling the paper? They couldn't hear the word. They just hear, And he told me, he said, you know what it was? I can't even, he says, they were arguing about Henry Kissinger's obituary. They write these in advance, the obituary. Half the people wanted to say, war criminal dead. The other half wanted to say, Nobel laureate Secretary of State is dead. And they had a tremendous argument for hours on end, because he's in his 90s, he's going to die soon. So they didn't know, they finally, he said, they compromised on controversial statements. It was just interesting.
I just want to mention, when you're talking about science being
Yes.
the sort of the wisdom kind, that's.
Well,
what
science
we-
being the overall narrative we live by.
And that's true, and that's what it really frightens me. It doesn't frighten me, it upsets me. Because being a researcher and being a person who understands what the way we sort of consider science as the ultimate, most things are much too complex to be analyzed the way, with the instrumentation we have. And so people are sort of, in a way, it just happened this week, they're choosing as their God science.
Yes.
And then they don't even know what it means, because it's just a lie. And yet they're so wedded to that idea that the truth doesn't matter.
I'd say that's exactly right. I would say, another interesting thing about practical wisdom, again, I'm just still introducing, I agree completely with that, was once a fascinating study published in the Wall Street Journal of the 5 smartest presidents in the 20th century. The 5 smartest ones, all of whom failed as president. Very interesting, isn't it? All the 5 smart. So who are the 5 smartest presidents of the 20th century? Jimmy Carter.
Right. Nixon.
Nixon. This is IQ smart or school smart. Who are the other 3?
Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover, absolutely. Top graduate, first class at Stanford, graduated #1 in his class, translated Latin classics into English as a sideline. He was earning a living. He's a very smart guy. Very well. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow wrote 27 books, hated blacks, and was a vicious racist. And he failed as president. Couldn't get the U.S. So then they said, well, who were the, who were the, who were the successful presidents?